So next, let's talk about understanding the parts that engage in self-sabotage. And this is where we kind of incorporate my Awakened Genius blueprint. By now, we've established that self-sabotage isn't really sabotage, it's self-protection. Your brain isn't really trying to ruin your progress, it's trying to keep you safe from something it perceives as a threat. But here's where we go a little bit deeper, because it's not one part of you that's resisting change, it's a whole system. So inside you are different parts, right? We call them demons, different voices, different internal forces, each with their own agenda, their own fears, and their own reasons for either pushing you forward or holding you back. This is what I talk about in what I call the Awakened Genius blueprint. This is the process of recognizing, understanding, integrating these different parts, these demons, so they stop working against you and start working with you. We turn those demons into genius. Because the reality is, if you feel stuck in self-sabotage, it's not because you're weak. Because there's a battle happening inside you, right? The two wolves. One part that wants change and another that's digging its heels in, terrified of what the change might mean. And until you understand these parts, you'll keep fighting yourself. So let's break it down. Let's talk about the war between your parts. So imagine these two opposing forces inside of you. One part of you wants to change. This is the part that makes the meal plan, signs up for the gym, sets big goals, and feels fired up about doing things differently. It's the part that says, this time, I'm going to break the cycle. This time, I'm taking control. But then, there's another part, your demon, part that resists. The part that pulls you back into old habits, makes excuses, procrastinates. It forgets why change even mattered to you in the first place. And this is the part that people usually call a self-sabotaging part. But let's pause right there. Because, again, what if this part isn't sabotaging you at all? What if it's protecting you? What if this part is stepping in to prevent you from getting hurt? Whether that hurt is failure, discomfort, rejection, or the pain of facing emotions you've buried for years. This is the key to the Awakened Genius blueprint. Understanding that every part of you is working toward what it thinks is your best interest, even when it looks like self-destruction. So here's why these parts work against your goals. So if these demons are trying to protect you, why do they feel like they're ruining everything? Because they're working from an outdated playbook. They're protecting you, but from old fears, not your current reality. So let's break down some of the most common reasons your protective parts kick in. Number one, again, fear of failure. If I don't try, I can't fail. A part of you might be terrified of failing, because if you try and you fail, then what? Painful hit to your identity or your ego. It's confirmation of every fear you've had about yourself. So rather than let you risk that, this part of you steps in and stops you before you can start, convinces you to procrastinate, to wait for the right time, to distract yourself with other things, not to punish you, but to keep you from experiencing the sting of failure. Next might be the fear of success. If I succeed, the pressure will be too much. This one, again, is sneaky, right? Success seems like the goal. But what happens after you succeed? If you lose weight, people will notice. They'll comment. They'll expect you to keep it off. If you start eating normally instead of binging and restriction, you'll lose the identity of being the person who's always struggling with food. If you finally get your emotional eating under control, you might have to deal with why you were eating emotionally in the first place. Success raises the stakes. And if a part of you believes that you won't be able to handle that pressure, it'll shut things down before you get too far. You know what you should do. You set goals, make a plan, tell yourself this time will be different, and then you do the opposite. You promise yourself you'll stick to that new habit. No more late night snacking, no more emotional eating, no more self-sabotage. But a week later, you find yourself right back where you started, wondering what the hell happened. Why do we do this? Why do we work so hard to build new habits only to tear them down? Why does it feel like there's a war inside of us? One part that wants change and another that pulls us back into old patterns? Well, what if I told you that self-sabotage isn't really sabotage at all? What if, instead of seeing it as an enemy, we saw it as self-protection? A part of you stepping in to keep you safe from discomfort, from uncertainty, from change, even if that protection is keeping you stuck in habits that no longer serve you. That's what we're breaking down today. Why we repeat old patterns, why we think we're sabotaging ourselves, when really, we're just trying to feel safe, and most importantly, how to work with those parts of yourself instead of fighting against them. Welcome to Food on the Mind, Awakened Genius, where we break free from food obsession, unlock our potential, and build a life worth living. I'm Jeb Stuart Johnston, and here we dig into the psychology, philosophy, and strategy behind lasting change. Because transformation isn't just about what's on your plate, It's about what's on your mind. If you're here, I appreciate you. If you find this episode valuable, do me a favor, hit subscribe, leave a review, and if you're watching on YouTube, drop a like and a comment. It helps more than you know. Now, let's dive in. So why do we do this? Why do we work so hard to build new habits only to tear them down? Why does it feel like there's a war inside of us? One part that wants change and another that pulls us back into old patterns. So what we think of as self-sabotage is really self-protection. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what most people get wrong about self-sabotage. When we think about it, we usually frame it as a personal flaw, like it's proof that something is broken in us. We tell ourselves, I just don't have enough willpower, or I'm too lazy, or I must not want it badly enough. That's what we've been led to believe, that if we keep falling off track, it's because we lack something. Discipline, motivation, the ability to just stick to the damn plan. That's frustrating as hell. Because logically, you do want to change. You do want to feel better in your body, to stop eating when you're not hungry, to move in a way that makes you feel strong instead of punishing yourself. And yet, there's always something that pulls you back. You start seeing progress, and then you suddenly fall off. You make a commitment, but the excuses start stacking up. You know what you need to do, but somehow you can't bring yourself to do it. And that's the part that really messes with your head, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. Why would you sabotage something you want? Why would you destroy your own progress? Well, what if you're not? What if self-sabotage isn't sabotage at all? So here's the reframe. Self-sabotage is protection. Here's the truth. Self-sabotage isn't about rebellion. It's not about laziness or weakness or some deep, unfixable flaw in your personality. Self-sabotage is self-protection. Let me say that again. That part of you that keeps pulling you back, it's not trying to screw up your life. It's trying to keep you safe. Safe from discomfort, safe from failure, safe from stepping into something unfamiliar, because to your brain, unfamiliar can feel like dangerous. Your mind isn't wired for success. It's wired for survival. And sometimes sameness, even if it's painful, even if it's miserable, feels safer than change. Because change is unknown. Change means risk. Change means stepping into something new where you don't have guarantees, where you might fail, where you might get hurt. And so your brain does what it's been trained to do. It pulls you back to what it knows. It whispers, let's just do what we've always done. That's safer. That's easier. And that's when you start to see the same old patterns pop up. So how does self-sabotage show up in your life? Well, self-sabotage isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's sneaky, right? It disguises itself as logic, as practicality. It's just not being in the right place right now. Let me give you some examples. For one, procrastination and avoidance. You know those things that you know would help you. The habits, the actions, the conversations you keep putting off. It's not laziness. That's a protective mechanism kicking in. Because what if you do commit to change and fail? What if you prove to yourself that you're not good enough? Better to avoid it altogether, right? Because at least then you don't have to deal with that feeling of failure. Or how about falling off when things are going well? You ever notice how right when you start seeing progress, you suddenly sabotage yourself? You're eating well, feeling good, and then out of nowhere, you binge. You're finally consistent with your workouts, and then suddenly you stop going. Why? Because success creates pressure. When things are going well, a part of you starts to panic. What if I can't keep this up? What if I mess it all up? What if people start expecting more from me? And rather than risk disappointment, your brain slams on the brakes. 3 might be making excuses and rationalizing why now isn't the right time. Maybe I'll start when things calm down at work. I just need to get through this stressful period first. It's not the right time. I have too much going on. Sound familiar? Your brain is so good at coming up with reasons to delay change, because as long as you're waiting for the perfect time, you don't actually have to take the risk of trying. Number 4 might be creating chaos when you start making progress. This one hits close to home, right? You got momentum, you're feeling good, and then suddenly everything in your life feels chaotic. You pick a fight with your partner. You take on extra responsibilities at work. You fill your plate with anything that will take your focus away from the thing you were working on. Why? Because peace and progress can feel unnerving when you're used to chaos. If your nervous system is wired for stress, if you've spent most of your life in survival mode, then calm can actually feel unsafe. So what do? You create a storm. You go back to what feels normal. So why does this matter? Why is all of this important? Because if you keep thinking of self-sabotage as a flaw, you're just going to keep trying to fight yourself, and you'll lose. But if you recognize that these patterns aren't about failure, but about protection, then everything changes. Because now, instead of beating yourself up, you can start asking better questions. What am I protecting myself from? What fear is coming up when I try to change? What part of me doesn't feel safe stepping into something new? When you start seeing self-sabotage for what it really is, a defense mechanism, not an attack, you can stop trying to push through with sheer willpower and start working with yourself instead of against yourself. And that's when real, lasting change becomes possible. So let's talk about how to do that. So here's why change feels like a threat. So we know that self-sabotage isn't actually sabotage. It's self-protection. It's your brain keeping you in familiar territory because it believes that's the safest place to be. But here's the next big question. Why does change feel so threatening in the first place? Right? You'd think that making healthier choices, eating in a way that feels good, moving your body, breaking free from obsessive thoughts about food would be a no-brainer. And logically, yeah, it should be. But your brain isn't just operating on logic. It's operating on survival. And to your nervous system, change, no matter how positive, feels like stepping into the unknown. And the unknown? That's where danger lives. Your brain has one job above all else: keep you alive. It doesn't care if you're happy. It doesn't care if you're thriving. It cares about one thing: predictability. Because predictable means safe. Think about it. If something is familiar, your brain already knows how to handle it. It's been here before. It knows what to expect. Even if it sucks, at least it's known. But change? Change means stepping into something new. New patterns, new behaviors, new expectations. And even though you might be excited about that change, there's a part of you that sees it as dangerous. Because what if it doesn't work? What if you fail? What if you can't handle it? What if you lose yourself in the process? So what does your brain do? It pulls you back. Not because it wants you to stay miserable, but because it thinks it's keeping you safe. Have you ever heard the phrase, better the devil you know than the devil you don't? At the Food on the Mind, we often talk of demons and how each of those demons that hold us back from our full potential also carry with them the genius that have been fundamental in our success. That's basically how your brain operates when it comes to change. If you've spent years using food to cope with stress, if binging or restricting has been your way of dealing with emotions, then that pattern, no matter how destructive, is familiar. Your brain knows exactly how it works. And if you suddenly start trying to change, eating differently, feeling your emotions instead of numbing them, stepping outside your comfort zone, your brain sounds the alarm. Because now you're on unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory, well, that's unpredictable. And if it's unpredictable, it might be dangerous. So even if you're working towards something good, even if you want this change more than anything, your brain might still resist it. It might start throwing up roadblocks, excuses, doubts, fears, little whispers in your mind saying, maybe this isn't the right time. Maybe this isn't working. Maybe you're just someone who can't change. Not because any of that is true, but because it keeps you from stepping into the unknown. So here's why staying the same sometimes feels safer than growth. Even if your current patterns are making you miserable, even if you hate the way you feel when you fall into emotional eating or self-sabotage, there's a part of you that finds comfort in it because at least it's known. Think about it. If you've always struggled with food, if you spent years believing that you just don't have control, if emotional eating has been a part of your life for as long as you can remember, then that's your normal. And as much as you might want to change, part of you might also be thinking, who am I without this struggle? What happens if I change and still don't feel happy? What if I try and fail? Then what? Because at least right now, in the struggle you understand the rules. You binge, you feel guilty. You promise to do better. You diet, you restrict. You eventually give up and the cycle starts again. That cycle might suck, but it's predictable. And predictable feels safe. So now let's go even deeper. For a lot of people, emotional eating isn't just a habit. It's an identity, right? If you've spent years turning to food when you're stressed, if dieting and binging have been a constant in your life, if you've always seen yourself as the one who struggles with food, then who are you without that struggle? Because if you really change, then suddenly you have to rewrite your story. And that's scary. Because even if the old story isn't a good one, At least you know it. This is why change isn't just about breaking habits. It's about reshaping who you believe you are. And if part of you still sees yourself as the person who always falls back into old patterns, the person who can't be trusted around food, the person who struggles, then even if you start making progress, that part of you might panic. It might do whatever it can to pull you back to the identity it knows. Not to hurt you, not to punish you, but because it thinks it's keeping you safe. So how can we make change feel safe? If self-sabotage is really self-protection, and if your brain is wired to resist change because change feels like a threat, how do you actually change without setting off every internal alarm? The answer isn't pushing harder. It's creating safety within change. It's showing your brain that you can change and that you can do more, that you won't lose yourself in the process. How do you do that? You start small. Your brain panics when change feels too big. Instead of overhauling everything overnight, focus on one shift at a time. Something small enough that your brain doesn't see it as a threat. Make the unfamiliar feel familiar. Instead of seeing change as stepping into the unknown, connect it to something you already know, right? If you're adding movement into your routine, think of it as reclaiming your body, not punishing it. If you're eating differently, frame it as nourishing yourself, not restricting. Reassure the part of you that's scared. When you feel resistance, don't ignore it. Acknowledge it. Ask yourself, what am I afraid of? What feels unsafe about this? When you listen to that fear instead of fighting it, you take away its power. Next, shift your identity gradually. Instead of telling yourself, I'm broken and need to be fixed, start seeing yourself as someone who's learning, someone who's growing, someone who's figuring it out. Your identity isn't set in stone. You can evolve into the version of yourself that no longer needs self-sabotage as protection. Because that's the real work, not just changing habits, but changing the way you see yourself. And when you do that, when you create safety within change, you stop fighting yourself. You stop feeling like you're at war with your own mind, and you finally start moving toward the life you actually want to live. So how do you start to work with and not against yourself? We've broken this down. Self-sabotage isn't actually sabotage, it's self-protection. And change, even when it's good, can feel like a threat because your brain is wired for sameness over success. Which brings us to the real question. If you can't force your way through self-sabotage, if pushing harder and relying on willpower isn't the answer, then what is? How do you actually change without setting off every alarm in your nervous system? You stop fighting yourself. You stop seeing self-sabotage as the enemy and start working with it. Because here's the thing. When you understand what's actually happening, when you see that the part of you resisting change isn't trying to ruin your life, but trying to protect you, you stop needing to rely on discipline because you're no longer in a war with yourself. Instead, you're leading yourself forward in a way that feels safe. So step one is we need to identify the fear that's holding you back. Every time you self-sabotage, there's a reason, a real, deeply rooted reason. And it's never just about food. The late night binge, it's not because you have no willpower. It's because food has become your buffer against stress, loneliness, or exhaustion. Skipping workouts, it's not because you're lazy. It's because working out might trigger something uncomfortable. Maybe it reminds you of past failures, or maybe it makes you confront the fact that you've been disconnected from your body for a long time. Falling off track when you start making progress, it's not coincidence. It's your brain stepping in and saying, this is unfamiliar. What if we fail? What if we lose what's comfortable? What if this doesn't last? So before you even try to push through resistance, stop and ask, what am I really afraid of here? And don't settle for the surface answer. Go deeper. Because whatever comes up, that's the thing your self-sabotage is trying to protect you from. And until you acknowledge it, it's going to keep running the show. Step 2, create safety within change. Once you know what your resistance is actually about, the next step isn't to ignore it. It's to make change feel safe. Because remember, your brain isn't resisting change because it's bad. It's resisting because it's unknown. So your job is to retrain it, to show it that this new way of being, it's not a threat. How do you do that? Well, shrink the size of the change. If your brain thinks you're overhauling your entire life overnight, it's going to resist hard. Instead, focus on micro changes. What's one thing I can do today that moves me forward? Make it so small that your brain doesn't even register it as a threat. Next, acknowledge the part of you that's afraid. When you feel resistance, instead of bulldozing through it, pause. Literally talk to yourself. Hey, I see what's happening here. I know this feels scary. But I promise we're safe. We are okay. This isn't punishment. This is us growing. Focus on identity, not just actions. Instead of saying I'm trying to lose weight, shift it to I'm becoming someone who takes care of myself. Instead of I need to stop binging, I'm trying to learn to listen to my body in a new way. Your identity has always been stronger than your habits. Change who you believe you are, and the actions will follow. Now, caveat, we have to understand there's limitations to having identity wrapped up in things. So don't allow that identity to be something that you cannot manage. Next, try to tie your change to something familiar, right? Your brain fights new things. But if you connect new habits to existing ones, they feel safer. If you already have a morning coffee routine, add a few deep breaths before your first sip. If you already listen to music in the car, stack a self-check-in onto that habit. Make new behaviors feel less new. You're not forcing change. You're inviting it in a way that your nervous system can handle. And that's the difference between change that sticks and change that feels like a fight. So step 3 is stop the all or nothing trap. Let's talk about one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're trying to change. They go all in. They decide, that's it, I'm done with emotional eating. I'm going to eat clean, exercise every day, meditate, journal, get 8 hours of sleep, and become a whole new person starting right now. And what happens? Last a few days, maybe a couple weeks, but eventually the pressure builds. Then one slip out, a missed workout, a stress eating moment, a skipped meditation session, feels like failure. And the brain panics. See, we knew this wouldn't last. May as well go all the way back to what we know. Sound familiar? This is the all or nothing trap. And it's one of the biggest ways people set themselves up for failure. Because here's the truth. You don't need to be perfect to change. You don't need to do everything right. You just need to keep moving forward, even if it's messy, even if it's slow. So instead of aiming for perfection, shift your mindset. Instead of, I have to eat perfectly, try, I'm learning to nourish myself in a way that feels good. Instead of, I have to work out every day, try, movement is something I'm building into my life one step at a time. Instead of, I can't ever binge again, try, I'm learning how to listen to my body without judgment. Change doesn't happen because you never fall back into old habits. It happens because you don't let one step back turn into a full sprint in the other direction. Step 4, build trust with yourself. At the core of all this is one thing, trust. When you spent years in patterns of self-sabotage, you don't just stop trusting the process, you stop trusting yourself. You start to believe that you always mess up, that you always go back to old habits, that you can't be consistent. And that belief alone, it's enough to keep you stuck. Because if you don't trust yourself, you won't even let yourself try. So how do you rebuild that trust? Follow through on small things. If you say you'll drink a glass of water in the morning, do it. If you say you'll take a deep breath before eating, do it. It doesn't have to be huge. It just has to be consistent. Forgive yourself faster. When you slip up, don't let it spiral. Acknowledge it, learn from it, and move on. What would I say to a friend in this situation? Now say that to yourself. Stop making promises you can't keep. If you don't actually plan on going to the gym 5 days a week, don't tell yourself you will. Start with what's realistic. Build from there. Prove to yourself over and over that you're showing up. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but consistently. Because when you start trusting yourself again, everything changes. You don't have to force motivation. You don't have to battle willpower. You don't have to fight against yourself anymore. Instead, you start working with yourself. And that's how you break free. Not by pushing harder, but by leading yourself in a way that finally feels safe. So next, let's talk about understanding the parts that engage in self-sabotage. And this is where we kind of incorporate my Awaken Genius blueprint. By now, we've established that self-sabotage isn't really sabotage, it's self-protection. Your brain isn't really trying to ruin your progress, it's trying to keep you safe from something it perceives as a threat. But here's where we go a little bit deeper, because it's not one part of you that's resisting change. It's a whole system. So inside you are different parts, right? We call them demons, different voices, different internal forces, each with their own agenda, their own fears, and their own reasons for either pushing you forward or holding you back. This is what I talk about in what I call the Awaken Genius blueprint. This is the process of recognizing, understanding, integrating these different parts, these demons, so they stop working against you and start working with you. We turn those demons into genius. Because the reality is, if you feel stuck in self-sabotage, it's not because you're weak. Because there's a battle happening inside you, right? The two wolves. One part that wants change and another that's digging its heels in, terrified of what the change might mean. And until you understand these parts, you'll keep fighting yourself. So let's break it down. Let's talk about the war between your parts. So imagine these two opposing forces inside of you. One part of you wants to change. This is the part that makes the meal plan, signs up for the gym, sets big goals, and feels fired up about doing things differently. It's the part that says, time, I'm going to break the cycle. This time, I'm taking control. But then there's another part, your demon. Part that resists, part that pulls you back into old habits, makes excuses, procrastinates, it forgets why change even mattered to you in the first place. And this is the part that people usually call a self-sabotaging part. But let's pause right there. Because, again, what if this part isn't sabotaging you at all? What if it's protecting you? What if this part is stepping in to prevent you from getting hurt? Whether that hurt is failure, discomfort, rejection, or the pain of facing emotions you've buried for years. This is the key to the Awakened Genius Blueprint, understanding that every part of you is working toward what it thinks is your best interest, even when it looks like self-destruction. So here's why these parts work against your goals. So if these demons are trying to protect you, why do they feel like they're ruining everything? Because they're working from an outdated playbook. They're protecting you, but from old fears, not your current reality. So let's break down some of the most common reasons your protective parts kick in. Number one, again, fear of failure. If I don't try, I can't fail. A part of you might be terrified of failing, because if you try and you fail, then what? Painful hit to your identity or your ego. It's confirmation of every fear you've had about yourself. So rather than let you risk that, this part of you steps in and stops you before you can start, convinces you to procrastinate, to wait for the right time, to distract yourself with other things, not to punish you, but to keep you from experiencing the sting of failure. Next might be the fear of success. If I succeed, the pressure will be too much. This one, again, is sneaky, right? Success seems like the goal. But what happens after you succeed? If you lose weight, people will notice. They'll comment. They'll expect you to keep it off. If you start eating normally instead of binging and restriction, you'll lose the identity of being the person who's always struggling with food. If you finally get your emotional eating under control, you might have to deal with why you were eating emotionally in the first place. Success raises the stakes. And if a part of you believes that you won't be able to handle that pressure, it'll shut things down before you get too far. Next, we have avoiding discomfort. Change is hard and I don't want to deal with it. Let's be real. Change is uncomfortable. Even when it's positive, even when you want it, it still requires effort. It still pushes you into the unknown. And if there's a part of you that's wired for comfort, wired for ease, it's going to resist that change every step of the way. Not because it doesn't want you to grow, but because it's trying to keep you in a space where you don't have to struggle. And sometimes that means pulling you back into behaviors that feel easier, even if they're destructive in the long run. Next is emotional regulation. Food keeps me from facing bigger feelings. This is the biggest one when it comes to emotional eating, because for so many people, food isn't just food. It's a coping mechanism. It's a way to numb stress, a way to soothe anxiety, a way to distract from loneliness, boredom, or sadness. If food has always been your go-to for emotional regulation, then the part of you that turns to food isn't sabotaging you. It's protecting you from pain. It's giving you an escape. It's helping you feel better even if it's only temporary. And until you reach that part of you, a new way to regulate emotions, it's going to keep doing what it knows. So how about some real life examples, right? Let's make this real, because when you see these patterns in action, you start to recognize them in yourself. So example one, late night overeater, right? Been eating well all day, you feel good, you're sticking to your plan, and then nighttime hits. Suddenly you're in the kitchen eating things you don't even really want. Why? Because at night your guard's down. You're not busy. You're distracted. And you're conditioned to always be busy. So that part of you, the one that uses food to self-soothe, sees an opening. It steps in and says, hey, you've had a long day. You deserve this. This will make you feel better. It's not self-sabotage. It's self-soothing. It also gives you something to do. Feel busy. Feel productive. Because it's far too uncomfortable to just sit with yourself. Key is recognizing it and finding a new way to meet that need. Example two might be the person who avoids success. Like maybe you've been trying to level up in your career, but every time you get close to a breakthrough, you hesitate. You drag your feet. You make excuses. You convince yourself you're not ready. Why? Because success would mean being seen, being responsible, being held to a higher standard. And if a part of you is afraid that you won't be able to handle that, it will do everything it can to keep you from getting there. Example 3 would be staying in familiar patterns even when they hurt you. So maybe you've been in unhealthy relationships your whole life. And even though you know they're bad for you, you keep getting pulled back. Because the part of you that fears abandonment, the part of you that equates love with struggle, it feels safer in chaos than in peace. Not because you want to be stuck, but because that's the version of love that feels familiar. So what's the biggest shift you can make? Stop seeing these parts of you as the enemy. Instead, listen to them. Ask them what they're afraid of. Acknowledge that they're protecting you from. Reassure them that change is safe. Because when you do that, when you integrate these parts instead of fighting them, you stop battling yourself. And that's when real, lasting transformation happens. So how do we work with and not against these protective parts? Well, we've established the part of you that's self-sabotage. Again, we're going to recap here. Isn't actually trying to destroy your progress. It's trying to protect you. So the question now is, how do you get that part on your side? Because if you keep seeing it as the enemy, if you keep trying to force yourself to change while another part of you is digging its heels in, you're going to stay stuck in the same battle. The key is not to overpower this part. It's to listen to it, understand it, and work with it instead of against it. This is what the Awakened Genius Blueprint is all about, not eliminating these parts, but integrating them. So every part of you is moving in the same direction. So let's break down how to do that. Step 1, identify the part that's resisting change. The next time you find yourself self-sabotaging, don't just write it off as a lack of discipline. Pause and ask, who is speaking here? Because if one part of you is resisting change, that means there's another part, one that's afraid, one that's uncertain, one that's doing everything it can to keep things predictable. Your job isn't to silence it. Your job is to figure out what it's trying to protect you from. Example, let's say you keep breaking your own food rules. You commit to eating a certain way, you feel great about it, and then bam, you suddenly find yourself overeating, breaking the very habits you were trying to establish. Instead of just saying, I have no willpower, ask, what's the fear behind following through? Maybe it's the fear of deprivation. Maybe it's the fear that if you let go of food as a coping mechanism, you won't know how to handle your emotions. Maybe it's the fear that if you succeed, people will expect more from you, and that feels overwhelming. Whatever it is, it's there for a reason. And until you acknowledge that reason, this part of you is going to keep stepping in to protect you by pulling you back into old habits. Step 2, listen without judgment. Once you've identified the part that's resisting change, the next step is to listen to it without judgment, without trying to override it, without immediately forcing yourself to power through. Because the moment you try to push past this part, it's just going to push back harder. Instead, get curious. Ask, what are you afraid will happen if I actually follow through with this goal? What do you think you're protecting me from? And really listen. Because most of the time, there's a deeper fear beneath the surface. Maybe it's the part of you that learned as a kid that food was a source of comfort and connection, and now giving it up feels like losing a part of yourself. Maybe it's the part of you that associates weight loss with past experiences of judgment or rejection, and now it's afraid of stepping into that space again. Maybe it's the part of you that's seen you start and fail so many times that it's trying to save you from that pain by stopping you before you even start. These parts have reasons for what they're doing. They're not irrational. They're just working off old data. And once you acknowledge why they're resisting, you can start to work with them rather than just trying to overpower them with brute force. Step 3 will be to negotiate with the part instead of fighting it. Now, here's where most people get it wrong. When they identify the part of them that's resisting, their first instinct is to try to eliminate it. They say, I just need to stop thinking this way. Or I need to get rid of this part of me that keeps pulling me back. But the moment you try to destroy a part of yourself, it digs in deeper. Because from its perspective, it's trying to help you. So instead of seeing this part as the enemy, try negotiating with it. For example, let's say you have a part of you that says, I'm afraid I'll lose control if I stop emotional eating. Rather than trying to override it, ask it what it needs. Maybe it needs reassurance that you're not going to suddenly restrict yourself into misery. Maybe it needs a new coping mechanism, one that might actually help regulate your emotions instead of just suppressing them. Maybe it needs to know that you're not abandoning it, that you're not trying to force change, but that you're open to working with it to find a solution that feels safe. This is the difference between lasting change and short-term willpower. Because if you don't get that part on board, it's going to keep resisting. But if you show it that there's another way, a way where it still gets to protect you, but in a healthier, more effective way, it stops fighting you. And suddenly you're not at war with yourself anymore. Step 4, create a plan that feels safe, not just effective. This is the last step, right? Make sure that the plan you're creating doesn't just look good on paper. It has to feel safe to your nervous system. Because if your plan is too rigid, too extreme, or too overwhelming, your protective parts are going to slam on the brakes. So how do you start to make a plan that feels safe? Start smaller than you think you need to. Instead of cutting out emotional eating completely, start by creating a 5-minute pause before you eat. Instead of forcing yourself into an intense workout routine, start with 10 minutes of movement a day. Next, build in flexibility. The more all or nothing your approach is, the more likely your protective parts are going to resist. Give yourself permission to make mistakes, to adjust, to learn as you go. Next, acknowledge and reassure your parts. Every time you feel resistance creeping in, pause. Say, I see you. I know you're trying to protect me, but we are safe now. We don't need to use the same old patterns anymore. It might sound weird, but it works. Track safety, not just success. Instead of only measuring progress in weight loss or habit streaks, measure how safe you feel in this process. If you feel panicked or like you're forcing yourself, slow down. It's a sign that a part of you is feeling threatened. And that's exactly when self-sabotage kicks in. Because remember, lasting change isn't about pushing harder. It's about working with yourself, not against yourself. And when you create a plan that feels safe, when you make space for these parts instead of trying to eliminate them, that's when transformation actually sticks. So next, let's talk about integration over elimination, because the biggest shift you can make in this journey is to stop trying to eliminate the parts of you that resist change, because those parts aren't the enemy. They're just scared. They're just doing what they've always done, protecting you in the only way they know how. And the more you fight them, the harder they'll fight back. But when you start working with them, when you acknowledge their fears, when you help them feel safe, when you show them there's another way, that's when everything changes. That's when you stop being at war with yourself. That's when you stop cycling through self-sabotage. That's when every part of you starts moving in the same direction toward the life, the habits, and the freedom you actually want. And that's the real goal. Not forcing yourself into change, but awakening every part of you to the truth that you can change, that you are safe, and that every part of you, no matter how resistant, is worthy of being heard. Now let's talk about what happens when all these parts start working together. All right, so we've covered a lot. We've broken down why self-sabotage isn't actually sabotage, it's self-protection. We've explored why change feels like a threat to your nervous system and how your brain fights to keep things predictable, even when that predictability is making you miserable. And we've talked about how the Awakened Genius Blueprint, how understanding and integrating your internal parts is the key to stopping the cycle of self-sabotage for good. But now, I want to bring it all together, because the truth is, awareness is great, but it's not enough. Knowing why you do something is the first step, but learning how to shift it, that's the part that changes everything. So let's talk about the fundamental shift you need to make if you want to stop fighting yourself and finally move forward. You are not broken. You are adapted. One of the biggest lies we tell ourselves is that we're broken, that something is wrong with us, that we're fundamentally flawed because we can't seem to stick to our commitments, that we just need more willpower, more discipline, more grit. But let's be real. How many times have you tried to force yourself to change? How many times have you told yourself this time will be different, only to end up back in the same loop? If willpower alone was the answer, you'd be there already. So let's drop the idea that you're broken, because you're not. You're adapted. Your patterns, your habits, your tendencies, your emotional eating aren't proof that something is wrong with you. They're proof that you've survived, that at some point in your life, these behaviors served a purpose, that a part of you learned, this is how we cope. This is how we stay safe. This is how we protect ourselves from pain. And now that part of you is still trying to do its job. The problem isn't that you're weak. The problem is that you haven't yet shown that part of you a new way to feel safe. And that's where the shift happens. We're going to go from fighting to leading. Most people approach self-sabotage like it's a battle, like they need to crush their cravings or silence their inner critic or push through resistance with pure force. But here's the thing. When you try to fight yourself, you create an internal war. And the more you fight, the more your protective parts fight back. So instead of trying to overpower these parts, try leading them. Think about it like this. If you were leading a team and one of your team members was scared, hesitant, or resisting change, what would you do? Would you yell at them, call them weak, demand they get in line? Or would you listen? Would you understand their concerns? Would you show them through action that they're safe? That's what leading yourself looks like. And when you start leading instead of battling, your protective parts stop resisting. Because they don't need you. They trust you now. So how do we move from self-sabotage to self-leadership? Here's the question. What would happen if, instead of fighting yourself, you stepped into self-leadership? What if, instead of trying to fix or force yourself into change, you started leading the parts of you that are scared? What if, instead of beating yourself up for struggling, you got curious about what that struggle is trying to protect you from? Because when you make this shift, when you start seeing your internal parts as allies instead of enemies, you stop cycling through the same patterns. You stop sabotaging your own progress. You stop getting pulled back into old habits. You stop treating yourself like a problem to be solved. And you start trusting yourself to make choices from a place of wisdom, not fear. To listen to your body and what it actually needs. To step into change without setting off every alarm in your nervous system. Because at the end of the day, your goal isn't just to break free from emotional eating. It's to step into a version of yourself that no longer needs emotional eating to feel safe. And that's when the struggle stops feeling like a fight. So here's the one thing I want you to take away from this episode. It's this. You don't need to fix yourself. You don't need more discipline, more willpower, more punishment. You need trust. Trust that your protective parts are doing their best with the information they have. Trust that when you lead them, instead of fighting them, they will get on board. Trust that change doesn't have to feel like war. It can feel like coming home, because that's what this is really about. It's not about controlling food. It's not about fixing emotional eating. It's about creating a relationship with yourself where you don't need food to escape, where you don't feel like you're your own worst enemy, where every part of you is moving in the same direction toward the life, the health, and the freedom you actually want. And that's where real transformation happens. So here's what I want you to do. Over the next few days, pay attention. Notice the moments where resistance kicks in. Notice the times when a part of you starts making excuses, rationalizing old habits, or pulling back from something you know is good for you. And instead of forcing yourself forward, pause. What part of me is speaking right now? What is it afraid of? What does it need in order to feel safe moving forward? Because when you stop fighting yourself, when you stop treating change like a war, you finally start making progress in a way that lasts. And that's what we're here for. Not quick fixes, not all or nothing cycles, but real sustainable change rooted in understanding yourself, leading yourself, and awakening the parts of you that have been holding you back for so long. That's the work. That's the shift. And when you make it, everything changes. I appreciate you being here today. If this resonated, if you had any aha moments, send me a message, jeb@foodonthemind.com. I love hearing how this work is landing for you. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, please share this episode with them. Because the more we talk about this, the more people can break free from the cycle of self-sabotage and start creating real, lasting change. Until next time, awaken yourself, awaken your genius, awaken your power. Walk your path with intention, and I'll meet you along the way.